refuges. What I'm really fascinated by are equatorial refuges. So where are places that might survive? And in fact, this has been shown in the Pleistocene. Places that survived one of the last major climate events in paleo history have set the current blueprint for contemporary coral diversity. So if the past refuges have set a blueprint for today's diversity of coral reefs, can today's refuges also be a blueprint for future diversity? So if we think about equatorial or highlighted refuges, a lot of corals are asking, well, where's my climate refuge? And so are a lot of conservation scientists. And so one approach that myself and my colleagues have been taking over the last 3 years is to think about big data. So big data is trying to think about, well, not just what is a coral in Kenya or Madagascar going to do, but what are actually corals around the planet are going to do, and what are oceanographic variables and conditions that might help or encourage that. But you might think that big data is a buzzword, and we haven't really properly defined it yet. So I think here's the best definition I've found so far of big data. Big data is like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it, nobody really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everybody else is doing it, so everyone claims that they're doing it. This is a particularly brilliant quote from Duke University. So I certainly don't want to claim that I'm doing it but not doing it, but I just want to give you an idea of what I think about big data and how I think we're trying to approach these questions. Our approach to big data has been very field-driven. So thinking about where are scientists counting things underwater, where are places of corals, and then trying to find every coral scientist ever who's counted things. We bring those together. This is Joseph Mina, my brilliant collaborator at the University of Queensland, who has so far broken 2 supercomputers in 2 different countries. And that's actually my definition of big data, which is how many supercomputers have you broken? So we're crunching a lot of this in terms of mixed effects models, generalized additive mixed effects models, information theoretic framework. I think we've run a lot of models. And then we're trying to make some sense out of those in terms of what are the top models, what are the predictions coming out of that, and what can we learn from that. So I'd like to talk to you about searching for climate refuges. I'm going to do that in part 1, which is the oceanography, and then part 2, which is the ecology. So in part 1, we're using a database of existing bleaching observations. It's not the best database, it's certainly biased, but it's the only one in the world. And it's called reef-based, and what it does is it's given us nearly 2,700 observations since 1980 of places that have bleached or that have observed or have displayed severe bleaching, that's in red, and places that have observed no bleaching, that's in blue. So this could be citizen science, this could be professional scientists, this is from the gray literature, from the published literature, this is the database. When we're able to look at that is say, well, what are the conditions associated with places that bleached here in red and that didn't bleach here in blue? And what mine has done is pulled together some of the first 100-year sea surface temperature records for every coral reef pixel in the world. We've done that working with an oceanographer to say, well, what are the actual signals of climate variability, taking into account long-term climate oscillations. So if we have warm phases or cool phases of our climate cycles, are we seeing warm or cool anomalies? What's the duration of those anomalies? How frequent are they? Are those anomalies ordered? Or is there entropy? Or are they more consistent? And so what we can do for every pixel in the world is generate these kind of wavelet diagrams, where here in red, you see positive anomalies. So positive temperature anomalies, so that water gets too hot. In cold, you see blue, water gets too cold. And Ramana has derived about 45 different metrics of climate variability, speaking from these sea surface temperature histories. And what we found is that this 100 years of climate variability find actually new predictors of bleaching. So we're starting to see the power of cold anomalies, not just hot ones. And we're also finding the presence of both warm and cold anomalies back to back provokes more severe bleaching, as well as the entropy. So are these anomalies chaotic, or are they more ordered? And in fact, a more chaotic environment promotes less bleaching than a more ordered environment, which perhaps isn't too surprising. But what's interesting as well is that these climate variability models, when we compare them to the current products that are given to coral reef managers around the world, we're finding them to actually be about 100 times better. So this is certainly, I think, certainly calls for trying to incorporate both chronic and acute stress into how we're thinking about coral bleaching. What we've done with these data is say, well, from our top models, how can we actually predict the next probability of bleaching around the world? And I think the key thing here I wanted to show you is that, not surprisingly, it's a distribution. We're going to have some places that will bleach less, those are in blue. We're going to have other places that are going to bleach more, that are in red. We might have a bunch of places in the middle. And when we actually map where those places are, we start to get this global map of climate risk or climate refuge that, I think certainly provides some interesting hypotheses for how we make conservation decisions, specifically around refuges. These things are hard though, and I just wanted to highlight, this is a close-up of our model in the Pacific, and that Great Barrier Reef bleaching that you see there up in A was actually predicted only about a 0.7 probability chance of severe bleaching. Whereas out in the Solomon Islands, where you have much higher probabilities, we actually saw a lot less bleaching. So either the models are crap, entirely possible. The models need to be retrained for current bleaching event, which might have different patterns than past bleaching, entirely possible. Or also that even 0.7 probability of bleaching with its associated uncertainty is still something we need to be worried about if the Great Barrier Reef is bleaching us in this sort of bluish pixel. So certainly ongoing research, but just wanted to highlight, I think there starts to be very interesting questions you can ask as a proof of concept of what do we do with big data sets and how do we try to leverage that into decisions. So again, global data sets from this new bleaching event can certainly test, even retrain these models as a proof of concept about how we can apply big data. So that's our oceanographic approach. I guess one thing okay, what does an NGO do that's different from a scientist? Well, one thing we've done this year is actually write up we have a standard bracket assessment protocol for bleaching. We've written that up in a freely available PDF that goes step by step into how a very, you don't need transects, you just need a slate, and you just need to get in the water. And we provided data templates for anyone to enter this data, and I've written code that takes any survey that anyone sends me, it aggregates it into a global data set, and it starts to spit out results in real time. So learn how to code, learn how to use GitHub, and if you know how to do that already, come talk to me, because we have lots of cool data to work on. But I just wanted to highlight, this is an example of what an NGO does, as opposed to kind of focusing on the next paper or the next publication. It's like, okay, how can we get these tools out there to a bunch of different people? And it is self-serving, because then we get big data sets that we work collaboratively with everyone who's collected data on. So just wanted to highlight that. So searching for climate refuges part 2 is saying, well, we can probably find some oceanographic signals of climate refuges from those 100 years of sea surface temperature. What about ecological signals? Are there signals of diversity that suggest a place is done better than we might expect it to given its climate stress? So when I started my Smith Fellowship at the University of North Carolina, I had, as Rowan Barrett called it this morning, an outrageously insane idea to collect every underwater coral transect survey that anyone had done in the Indian and Pacific Ocean recently. And they could send it to me in an Excel file, and I somehow thought it would be a good idea to combine that into a global data set. People collect data in lots of different ways, it turns out, and have very different approaches to Excel files. But again, learn how to code in R, this makes these projects a lot easier. This is a project that could never have been done in Excel. So at the end of the day, we have, over, I guess, 2 years, more than 100 scientists contributed largely unpublished data from NGOs, universities, and agencies. We have data from over 2,300 sites, more than 35,000 individual corals. I'm actually going to say we've actually run over 80,000 models at this point. This slide needs to be updated, and indeed we have broken into supercomputers. What can this start to tell us? Well, when we aggregate this data all together, we start seeing these regional, we look at regional maps of diversity, we can look at drivers of diversity. So here we're just looking at total coral cover, number of genera. Here, stronger colored dots have more of the thing than lighter colored dots. And for the first time, we've also combined this with that trade information as well as new coral phylogenies to actually look at functional and phylogenetic diversity. We can start asking a lot of both basic and applied questions. One of those questions is, how congruent are different biodiversity components? These are correlations that are spatially corrected for spatial autocorrelation. We're finding that actually 21 out of these 28 comparisons are significantly correlated. So, for example, if you count number of genera underwater, you are getting some positive relationship with total cover, with functional diversity, with phylogenetic diversity. So things like this can start to guide our monitoring, what we're collecting or not collecting. But we can also start to look at what are the different drivers of different components of diversity, which is work kind of coming out of the R press right now. But one of the things I wanted to highlight to you, sort of wrapping this work up, is if we know about biodiversity, and say let's use number of genera as a proxy for all those other congruent things we showed, how did those overlay across our gradients of climate stress? And can we use both of these pieces of information to think about refuges? Well, interestingly, when we look at this very simple scatter plot, we see that those 2,300 reef sites are scattered all across those gradients. We see sites at low and high climate stress, we see sites at low and high biodiversity. And the applied aspect here is that I think we can use that information to start really incorporating climate-smart decisions into conservation so that climate isn't this elephant in the room that we don't take into account. So here I've just color-coded the 4 quadrants, but I'd like to make the argument that when we have lower climate stress, and again, these lines are just 50th percentiles. You can draw lines where you want, but in some places of lower climate stress, you might want to think about recovering or coral restoration if you have low biodiversity, but it's probably a good place to invest in those things because it might be more stable to climate change, might be more of this refuge. If you've got places with high biodiversity and a potential refuge, this might be a great place to think about protection or working with local stakeholders on removing other local stressors, as well as thinking about where are these refuges and are they connected across space. On the other side of the coin, there are certainly going to be places under high climate stress. And what do we do there? Well, in places of high climate stress where we still have a lot of biodiversity, this is sort of surprising. And this might be places where we want to innovate and experiment. Are these genetic adaptations or acclimations that are having species respond better than we would have expected? And similarly, in this kind of red zone of climate-tolerant resources, in this red zone, the focus here is manage and think about what resources are still climate-tolerant, because that might be all you have left. So Kenya is likely here in this red zone, and we're really starting to think about the precautionary management of a weedy parrotfish that provides about 40% of the catch to coastal communities. So portfolios and big data, I think, can really help provide information as we make these decisions, or certainly as a proof of concept for how information can be incorporated. Again, these are some of these locations. We plot them on a map. Some interesting questions start to come up about connectivity, as well as our assumptions. Do we want to protect and connect refuges? Or, as having a really interesting discussion this morning with Andrew Gonzalez, do we actually want to protect some of the most threatened places because those might have the highest selective sweeps for evolutionary rescue? So you can, but again, if you have big data sets and really awesome collaborators who model things, you can start asking those questions. And I just want to highlight that these are certainly pushing forward into some of the questions that I'd like to start addressing over the next 2 years. Specifically working with Marie-Josée Fortin and Marty Kukosik at the University of Toronto, we're going to be thinking about stepping stones to the future. Are these different types of conservation actions connected in space? Are there places we can prioritize for new stepping stone, marine protected areas? And how do we think about nonlinear population dynamics, which those corals are notorious for, into this framework? So, wrapping up, climate change can be a smaller elephant in the room, or it might not be an elephant in the room at all. But I just wanted to highlight, I hope this whirlwind tour that I've taken you on for coral reefs and conservation will last 43 minutes. Multiple stressors are important to understand, and they can be understood. And ecological theory can certainly help us do this. And I just wanted to highlight that climate change, has been predicted to be a dominant stressor on reefs for a long time, and indeed it is happening right now around the world. Coral traits and life histories can predict how communities respond to this, and working with amazing collaborators who put all of your data online as an open access resource is awesome, so I would recommend you work with people like that. Species matter for how we think about managing resilience to climate change. So whether we have sequential replacement of sensitive species with more tolerant species, that we can use that for thinking about how we manage resilience and how we think of our MPAs more resilient to climate change than non-MPAs, and find some interesting conclusions. And finally, I think big data is a really interesting frontier in trying to tackle some of this, particularly around climate refuges and what role those might have in conservation and where are they. So coming back to where I started the talk, back to our poor little stressed out corals right now getting superheated in the Great Barrier Reef, how does all this matter? How do you kind of wrap up all of this ecological theory and data and papers and really try to make it applied to conservation science or to applied outcomes? Well, I thought I'd just put together a few thoughts on why I think it's important to escape the ivory tower if you're doing conservation science, and some ways that I think you can do that. First of all, don't discount science. Conservation is fundamentally linked to strong science and of many disciplines. Today was just an example of how ecology can sort of engage with conservation, but really, you can be a good scientist in any kind of field. And just talk to people about why does your science matter. This can be ecology, evolution, computer science, I think is a real way of the future. If you can code and do big data and wrangle massive data sets, there are lots of applied questions that we need to ask. Social science, anthropology, conservation is fundamentally about changing people's behavior. Working across disciplines is huge and it's hard, but it's definitely the way to go. In terms of practical advice, I would say network, meet people inside universities, meet people outside universities. Really good science and research happens both inside universities and outside universities. Make those connections, go to conferences that have people from many sectors, meet them and listen, ask, what are they struggling with, what do they need, how can your science help? And finally, diversify. Conservation is certainly a lot about science, but it's also about communication, leadership, project management, outreach, partnerships, fundraising. For folks who I've met with today, that probably sounds like a broken record because I've been saying these words a lot, but they are incredibly useful. And I think trying to figure out how to bring that into our university settings is a really important question, as well as recognizing the resources that are available to us through things like the Lieber Arrow Fellows Program, the Smith Fellows Program, and many, many others. So before I'd like to take questions, I'd just like to acknowledge the many, many important people, again, who have contributed to this talk and these ideas beyond. And as also everyone in this room knows, none of this work would have been possible without the support of the communities that we work with, that WCS works with, or especially the field programs that I work with. So I just want to thank everyone. And I'd like to thank you, and I'd be happy to dive into your questions.